Oh, and also if they're both scopes or the window or whatever, it doesn't even really bother checking against that. So that's that fourth clause down there. But there should never really be a time when you're putting scopes in a watch expression. Just don't do that. It doesn't make any sense. Isn't observable supposed to have that? Yes, ES6 is going to definitely help Angular quite a bit. It's going to allow Angular's dirty checking to be a lot more like Embers, actually, because it'll be able to put it, it's actually the proxies that it's going to be able to use. It's going to be able to use ES6 proxies on your plain old JavaScript objects to actually be able to know exactly which ones have changed and only check those inside of the digest cycle. But we're not going to actually be able to use that in browsers for a long time. But it will degrade nicely, which Embers will not. Like in Ember or Knockout, you're going to be stuck writing accessors even after ES6 is out. Whereas in Angular, if a browser can take advantage of proxies with ES6, you're going to immediately get a performance upgrade at the cost of nothing, and it will degrade, and you still get to use plain old JavaScript objects all around.
The order of operations for the watch list top down.
For the watch list?
Yeah.
Oh,
Just take the Angular expressions and execute top down.
inside of the parser?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, they're implemented actually inside of, yeah, it is, it's what you would expect it to be, yes.
Not the order of operations of the operators, but the order of the watch list itself.
Oh, the watch list? It doesn't matter what the order is of the watch list. You'll always turn out with the same result. That's the difference between it and change listeners. It's deterministic no matter what the order is. Right, because it always does a full digest cycle if anything's dirty. So no matter what, you're always getting up with the same state. Whereas with change listeners, the order in which you register them does determine the state. So you can end up with different states depending on the time in the system in which you ran them. Yes, it is. Davis just said that's the source of some really annoying knockout bugs, and it certainly is.
So the value doesn't actually change. If you had a function that changed the value, it wouldn't actually change until the completion of the digest cycle when it goes back through.
Well, the DOM doesn't render. It does change in the system and in memory. It absolutely does change, but it keeps running through the digest cycle as long as anything changed during that, and it doesn't allow a DOM render until that's all done. So from the user's perspective, what you said's right, in that it doesn't change until everything's done, but actually in memory it will.
It seems deterministic because one function could change another value in the same cycle.
Yeah.
It's not recursive or anything, but it's not. It has an impact on your other functions, so the order is significant.
The order is only significant if your functions are like using some sort of global variable off of a window or something. Otherwise, they're not. So it is a good, that is a good point. It's a good practice in Angular to make sure that your listeners are idempotent. You've got to expect that they'll be called by watch a bunch of times and to not use some crazy shared state thing off of a window because that's just bad anyway, but you could do that. So yeah, theoretically, like in the theory of digest cycles, it doesn't match the reality of JavaScript where you can misbehave and do crazy things.
Like you could square a number, put it back in the field that was already there, and every time through the digest cycle, it would square that number.
Yes.
So
Yeah, you could do that. Yeah. But you really shouldn't do that, but you could. We're not in a true functional programming language, so yes, you can do stuff like that. But realize that that's what you're doing, and just when you're registering a listener on a watch, just make sure that it doesn't change state of the system. Make sure that it's just it's being a good citizen of the landscape, and you'll be fine. It's actually really, it would be really awkward to cause a bug like that. You almost have to be causing it, which you certainly could.
Yeah, I think doesn't it like, after so many loops of the digest, it just stops and gives up and says, okay, we've done it 10,000 times.
It throws an error, yeah. And you can set that bounds too. You can change how many cycles it will go through. But I think by default it's 9, I think. So if it goes through more than 9 times, it assumes you're doing something insane and you should stop. And it goes to your exception handler at that point.
Is there a long polling, like server variable style watch that Angular uses, or is that outside of it?
Its HTTP service allows you kind of to do that inside of the digest cycle, but it's not like, you don't get any advantage over if you just set it up yourself, other than it calls $apply for you. You can do it yourself with XHR and just call $apply when appropriate, and you get the same behavior. And pretty much the same number of lines of code too.
Besides using the wrong type of watch, is there any other, like, what would you say your top 5 tips or missteps you can do with Angular that you would suggest people avoid?
Well, definitely using the wrong type of watch is number 1. Number 2, I would say, would be trying to, outside of directives, natively manipulate the DOM. That's really bad. Another one would be not using the appropriate type of binding into a directive, using a two-way binding when a two-way binding would be bad. Like one thing that you can do in Angular that we didn't even really get into, we didn't really get into directives, but you can do a two-way binding onto another scope inside of a directive, and if you bind something like a list, let's say, you're binding a list into the scope of a directive, and in here inside of this directive, you do like a scope.list equals scope.list .concat something else as a means of changing it, and you're not changing it in place. It's not, you're going to break the two-way data binding there, which is a little bit of a hole in Angular because you changed for reference, since concat creates a new array. So the thing that was bound on the outside of this directive is not going to be up to date with this. So that's actually one that we've run into in MedSeek in several spots. So you have to end up using things like, in Angular, when you want to do functional programming, by the way, Lodash is your friend much more than underscore, because Lodash includes methodology for in-place changing of lists. And for this exact reason, you'll want to use that instead of underscore, which is purely functional. But that's only 3, but those are the top ones.
Scope inheritance always bugs me.
Oh, not using an isolate scope?
No, just stepping on each other. We use the same.
Oh, yeah.
That happens. We write lots of directions.
Yeah, I mean, that can happen. Also, I see times when people get crazy behavior out of their directives because they're not using an isolate scope. And so they've got a bunch of different elements on the page that are all the same directive, and they haven't used an isolate scope, so the value of this one changes, and then the value of these two change too. A lot of times people who are new to Angular run into that one, and they're like, what the heck is going on?
Yeah, no, my favorite thing is the controller as. Inside your template, you can use controller as a variable name. So that way you can say variable name dot parent or something.
Oh, yeah.
And that way, if you have another scope that has the same variable name perchance as a child, it will replace it.
That's a good tip.
Yeah, we use the controller as syntax.
I don't really use that. That's a really good tip. Yeah, controller as.
Yeah, you can do it inside routes. Set up your route so you can do it on the element.
You're talking about using UI router?
Yes.
Yeah.
If not, does anybody else use the default router?
Believe it or not, yes.
Yeah, so controller as is really, really nice.
Yeah, UI router is really nice.
Yeah.
Very, very nice.